Well, good evening. I apologize for sending this late, but unfortunately, it's the week of Thanksgiving, so better late than never. So this week we're looking at chapters 15, 17, and 19. Now, first off, Latin America's post independence era was marked by political turmoil. Newly independent nations struggled to establish stable governments due to colonial legacies, social inequalities, and competing interests among different groups. This instability had far reaching consequences. Frequent coups and civil wars hindered economic growth, perpetuated social divisions, and made it challenging to implement policies for education, healthcare, and social welfare. The rise of caudillos further complicated efforts to build democratic institutions. Lack of experience with self government and democratic institutions made establishing stable political systems difficult for newly independent nations. Now, there was a legacy of colonial rule which created deep social and economic inequalities that fueled political unrest, particularly with concentration of power in the hands of a small elite, marginalization of indigenous and mixed race populations. Moreover, you had regional rivalries and competing interests among different provinces and social groups challenged efforts to forge national unity and consensus. Also, you had the influence of foreign powers, the US, Europe, which often undermined sovereignty and stability through interventions and economic domination. Ideological divisions between conservatives and liberals led to frequent conflicts and civil wars. Now, the conservatives favored centralized power and maintenance of traditional social hierarchies, while the liberals advocated for federalism and greater individual rights. The weakness of state institutions, particularly the military bureaucracy, made maintaining order and implementing policies effectively difficult. Economic instability contributed to social unrest and political turmoil. You had fluctuations in commodity prices, foreign debt. Then you had frequent changes in governments, coups, and civil wars that created certain uncertain and unpredictable environment. First, it discouraged long-term investments, and secondly, it hindered economic growth. Political instability led to the disruption of trade, destruction of infrastructure, and the flight of capital, further undermining economic development. The concentration of power and wealth in the hands of small elite perpetuated social and economic inequalities and limited opportunities for upward mobility. The lack of stable and accountable government institutions made implementing coherent policies and programs aimed at promoting education, healthcare, and social welfare difficult. Now, you had major events that occurred following the Wars of Independence. First, you had the Federal Republic of Central America established in 1823, uniting the countries of Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras, Nicaragua, and Costa Rica until its dissolution in 1838. The Cisplaine War between 1825 and 1828, which was fought between the United Provinces of Rio de la Plata, present day Argentina, and the Empire of Brazil over the territory of Cisplatina, present day Uruguay. Then you have the Peru Bolivian Confederation, which was formed in 1836 but dissolved in 3 years later following the War of the Confederation. And then the Mexican American War, 1846 to 48, resulting in Mexico losing a significant portion of its northern territory to the US. Now, caudillos emerged as charismatic leaders who relied on personal loyalty, patronage networks, and military force to maintain power, often at the expense of democratic institutions and the rule of law. They used populist appeals and promises of social reform to gain support from the masses, while simultaneously protecting interests of landed elite and foreign investors. They governed through a combination of authoritarianism, clientelism, personalism, and they concentrated power in their own hands and those of their inner circle. They engaged in power struggles and conflicts with other rival caudillos, leading to a cycle of coups, rebellions, and civil wars that destabilized countries and hindered long term political development. The rule of caudillos often perpetuated social and economic inequalities by relying on the support of wealthy and powerful to maintain grip on power. Some of them being Juan Manuel de las Rosas in Argentina, Porfirio Diaz in Mexico, which managed to establish relatively long periods of stability and economic growth, albeit at the cost of political freedom and social justice. Also, you had uncertain and unpredictable environment, which discouraged long-term investments and hindered economic growth. The rule of caudillos often perpetuated social and economic inequalities by relying on support of the wealthy and powerful to maintain grip on power. Now, the instability of the region's impact on the economics was as follows. Uncertain and unpredictable environment discouraged long-term investments and hindered economic growth, disruption of trade, destruction of infrastructure, and flight of capital, which further undermined economic development, the concentration of power and wealth in the hands of small elite, perpetuating social and economic inequalities and limited opportunities for upward mobility. Social and political ramifications. The lack of stable and accountable government institutions made implementing coherent policies and programs aimed at promoting education, healthcare, and social welfare difficult. Political violence and repression often targeted marginalized groups such as the indigenous, Afro descendants, the poor, exacerbating social tensions and hindering progress towards greater equality and inclusion. There was a constant state of political upheaval and uncertainty made it challenging for civil society organizations and social movements to mobilize and advocate for change, face threats, persecution, and co-optation by those in power. Historical and structural obstacles. The legacy of colonialism and the concentration of power in the hands of a small elite created deep-rooted obstacles to the development of representative and participatory democracy. The influence of caudillos and regional strongmen undermined the rule of law and the separation of powers necessary for a functioning democratic system. The ideological polarization between conservatives and liberals, as well as competing regional interests, made achieving consensus and compromise needed for stable democratic governance difficult. Institutional weakness and external factors. Well, you had weakness of state institution, judiciary, electoral bodies, civil service, which made ensuring free and fair elections, protecting individual rights, and holding those in power accountable challenging. Economic inequalities and concentration of wealth in the hands of a few created political systems that often prioritized interests of elite over those of the majority. This led to social unrest and challenges to democratic legitimacy. External interventions by foreign powers, particularly the US, often undermined its sovereignty and self determination, making it difficult to develop own democratic institutions and processes. The lack of strong and independent media, as well as limitations of freedom of expression and association, hindered the ability of citizens to participate fully in the democratic process and to hold leaders accountable. The U.S. intervened militarily in several Latin American countries to protect its economic interests and assert political influence. You had the Mexican American War, the Spanish American War. European powers, particularly Great Britain and France, maintained a strong economic presence in the region through trade, investment, and the establishment of commercial houses. The British Empire played a significant role in shaping the economic development of many Latin American countries through its control of key industries, mining, railways, and its role as a major creditor. The French intervention in Mexico from 1861 to 67 and the establishment of the Second Mexican Empire under Maximilian I showcased the continued European interest in the region. The growing influence of the US and European powers in Latin America sometimes led to conflicts with local governments and resistance from national movements. The concept of Pan Americanism, which emphasized solidarity and cooperation among the countries of the area, gained traction in the late 19th century as a response to foreign interventions. The disruption of trade, destruction of infrastructure, and the flight of capital further undermined economic development. The concentration of power and wealth in the hands of a small elite perpetuated social and economic inequalities and limited opportunities for upward mobility. The lack of stable and accountable government institutions made implementing coherent policies and programs aimed at promoting education, healthcare, and social welfare difficult. Political violence and repression often targeted marginalized groups. The constant state of political upheaval and uncertainty made it challenging for civil society organizations and social movements to mobilize and advocate for change, leading to threats, persecution, and cooptation. Key concepts and theories. Um, Positivism emphasized the importance of science, reason, and progress in shaping society and government. Modernization theory proposed that societies progressed through stages of development from traditional to modern. Social Darwinism applied Darwin's theory of natural selection to human societies, justifying social inequalities and imperialism. Liberalism advocated for individual rights. Free trade and limited government intervention in the economy. Classical liberalism emphasized laissez faire economics and minimal government interference, while reform liberalism sought to address social issues while maintaining a market based economy. Nationalism promoted a sense of shared identity and loyalty to the nation state, often based on common language, culture, and history. Secularization involved the separation of the church and the state and the decline of religious influence in public life. Industrialization referred to the shift from an agriculture to a manufacturing based economy driven by technological innovations and capital investment. Historical context and timeline in the 19th century. Between the 1850s and 1870s, the height of the Industrial Revolution in Europe and North America influenced Latin American countries to modernize. In the 50s, you had the rise of liberal governments in Latin America, such as Benito Juarez, Mexico, Jose Marmol in Argentina. In 1860, you had the expansion of railway networks in countries like Argentina, Brazil, and Mexico, facilitating trade and economic growth. 1864 to 70, you had the Paraguayan War, which had significant political and economic consequences for the region. In the 1870s, you had the establishment of a positivist influenced government, such as the Porfiriato in Mexico from 1876 to 1911. Between 1879 and 1883, you had the War of the Pacific between Chile, Peru, and Bolivia, driven by competition for nitrate resources. In 1888, the abolition of slavery in Brazil, the last country in the Americas to do so. The following year, the proclamation of the Republic in Brazil, ending the monarchy and establishing a federal system. Early populism. Chapter 19. First of all, you had a consolidation of nation states and centralization of power. As governments sought to assert control over their territories, adoption of liberal constitutions that guaranteed individual rights, separation of powers, and limited government. You also had the expansion of suffrage, although often limited to literate males with property qualifications. Also, another level of emergence of caudilloism, a form of strongman rule characterized by charismatic leaders and patronage networks. You also have the establishment of positivist influence governments that emphasize order, progress, and modernization. Mexico, for example, increased foreign intervention and influence, particularly from the US and Europe. The rise of opposition movements, including liberal reformers, radical intellectuals, and early labor organizations. These movements challenged the power of traditional elites and called for greater social and political reforms. Economically, you had a shift from subsistence agriculture to export oriented economies, focusing on primary commodities like sugar, coffee, and minerals. Also, you had the expansion of transportation infrastructure, particularly railroads and ports, to facilitate trade and economic integration. Railroad networks connected interior regions to coastal ports, enabling the export of goods to international markets. This also improved transportation, also facilitated the movement of people and ideas, contributing to social and cultural changes. And you have the growth of foreign investment and ownership in key sectors, such as mining, agriculture, and infrastructure. Then you had the emergence of a small but influential industrial sector, particularly in countries like Argentina, Brazil, and Mexico. The concentration of land ownership and the rise of large haciendas and plantations, often at the expense of indigenous communities and small farmers. You had increased economic dependence on foreign markets and vulnerability to global price fluctuations. You had a widening economic inequalities between the wealthy elite and the majority of the population, despite overall economic growth. Then this led to social and cultural shifts. You had rapid urbanization as people migrated from rural areas to cities in search of employment and opportunities. The growth of an urban working class and the emergence of new social problems such as overcrowding and poor living conditions. You did have the expansion of public education and literacy as government sought to create a skilled workforce and promote national unity. The establishment of public schools and universities, although access remained limited for many. You also had the secularization of society and the decline of the Catholic Church's influence in public life, separation of church and state, and the rise of anti clerical movements. The emergence of a small but growing middle class, particularly in urban areas and among professionals and bureaucrats. Continuation of racial and ethnic hierarchies, despite the formal abolition of slavery and legal equality. Indigenous and Afro descent populations face ongoing discrimination and marginalization. You also had the influence of European cultural trends such as Romanticism and Realism in literature and art. A rise of nationalism and the construction of national identities often was based on the idealized visions of the past and the exclusion of marginalized groups. The key figures and their early contributions in the period of populism were Domingo Faustino Sarmiento in Argentina, 1811 to 88, educator and politician who promoted public education and modernization as president. Benito Juarez in Mexico, 1806 to 72, liberal reformer and president who separated church and state and resisted French intervention. Emperor Pedro II, 1825 to 91, monarch who oversaw Brazil's modernization and the abolition of slavery. Andrés Bello, in both Venezuela and Chile, 1781 to 1865, an intellectual and educator who promoted the study of law, philosophy, and the Spanish language. Euclides da Cunha in Brazil from 1866 to 1909, writer and journalist whose work Os Sertões, Rebellion in the Backlands, explored the conflict between modernization and traditional society. Jose Marti in Cuba, 1853 to 1895, poet, journalist, and revolutionary who advocated for Cuban independence and Latin American unity. Flora Tristan in Peru, 1803 to 1844, socialist writer and activist who championed women's rights and workers' causes. Machado de Assis, a novelist in Brazil, 1839 to 1908, and poet who is considered a pioneer of Brazilian realism and one of the greatest Latin American writers of the 19th century. Legacy and impact on Latin American populism. You have the establishment of modern nation states with centralized governments and liberal constitutions. However, the consolidation of power often benefited a small elite at the expense of the majority. Economic modernization and integration into the global economy, but also increased dependence on foreign markets and investment. You have the expansion of transportation, communication, and education infrastructure, which laid the foundation for future development. Also, the secularization of society and the decline of the Catholic Church's influence in public life. You had the emergence of new social classes and the beginnings of labor and social justice movements. The continuation of social and economic inequalities, particularly along racial and ethnic lines. Intellectual and cultural shifts that emphasize science, progress, and national identity. An ongoing tension between the drive for modernization and the preservation of traditional values and ways of life. This set the stage for further political, economic, and social transformation in the 20th century, including the rise of populist and revolutionary movements. That's all I have for tonight. You all take care of yourselves. Any questions? Don't hesitate to email. Have a happy Thanksgiving. Bye.